Intro to Animal Nutrition. So for every lecture, we're going to have a lecture outline where I just talk about what we will be discussing throughout the lecture. So today we will be discussing what is nutrition. So that's kind of an obvious question maybe for some of us, but we'll be a little more specific about what nutrition actually is. And then we'll get into nutritional requirements. So what do all animals require to live? And then we're going to talk a little bit about animal feed composition and feed analysis. So how do we look at feeds? How do we compare feeds? What are we looking for? How do we know how much protein a feed has, how many carbs, etc. So that's what we'll finish up with today. So what is nutrition, right? It might be a pretty obvious question, but if you think about the science of nutrition, we're actually examining the qualitative and quantitative requirements of a diet or any diet necessary to maintain proper health. And we'll talk a little bit about what proper health means in terms of energy requirements, and so we'll have a whole lecture on that. But if we remember back to kind of what qualitative versus quantitative means, right? So qualitative is kind of the what, right? So what kind of nutrition, what are the requirements? And that's what we'll talk about next, are those nutritional requirements. And then quantitatively, we're talking about how much, right? So that's really where we get into how much energy is required for maintenance, for things like that, for just survival. And we'll talk about that as well in that energy lecture. So we'll talk a little bit about essential nutrients, right? So this is kind of that qualitative requirement. What are these essential nutrients that we all need, right? And then a balanced diet, right? So we need to have those correct nutrients, but they have to be in the correct amounts as well, right? So we have, and this is kind of species dependent, we all have various needs in the different amounts of nutrients, right? And again, this is all determined so that the animal can stay healthy. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we want this kind of balanced diet idea, right? So first, let's go through a couple of definitions and terms. So what is a nutrient, right? So this is a chemical element or compound that is in a diet or a feed that is required for normal life processes. So that's what we're going to focus on, those essential nutrients. And then we have, what's the difference between food and feed, right? So food is an edible material that provides those nutrients, and a feed is just something that we commonly use to designate animal food. So we usually don't use the word feed when we're talking about human food, right? So that's just a little bit different in terms of, human versus animal food. And so food stuff or feed stuff is material that can be made into or used as food or feed, right? So something that can be processed maybe into a feed. And then a diet is just a mixture of those feedstuffs or foodstuffs used to supply the nutrients to an animal, right? So it's just a mixture of these things. And then a ration is just the daily allocation of food or feed. So how much does that animal get per day, right? So before we get into the nitty-gritty of nutritional requirements and things like that, there's really kind of this idea of the art of feeding. And this really applies especially to you guys that are working in zoos and habitats that may or may not have multiple species at a time, exotic species. And so there's really this art of feeding where you're not really just worrying about the balanced diet, but you're worrying more about how does the animal actually acquire the food, right? So you have to prepare these diets in a way that the animal is, one, able to eat it, and two, maybe wants to eat it, right? So all these things that are going to go into preparing a diet for an animal. You also want to present the food so that in maybe a mixed species habitat, you want the correct species to get the correct diet, right? So that can be a challenge as well. You also want the food to stay clean, so feed bowls, things like that, that you're able to present the food in a clean manner, but also keep it so that the animal wants to eat it and is able to eat it. So again, these are kind of these ideas that we'll discuss throughout the course and kind of continue in all the different lectures, but just to kind of give you an idea of this art of feeding, especially in, zoos and these exotic animal enclosures. So what are these nutritional requirements that we all need? So whether we're talking about animals or plants, we both require water and energy to survive. Now, plants are pretty lucky because they can make their own energy, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So they can undergo photosynthesis and actually use solar energy to produce their own sugar. And so we can't do that. I wish we could, but we can't do that, right? So we have to consume our energy in the form of sugar, protein, fat, right? Those three different sources of sugar. And we call that cellular respiration. So we undergo cellular respiration by consuming sugar, and then we breathe in oxygen, and then we produce energy, right, in the form of chemical energy or ATP, and we release heat. Right? So we release heat, it's an exothermic reaction, and we produce water and carbon dioxide. And what's great about the photosynthesis is it's the complete opposite reaction. So plants are able to take in carbon dioxide and water and produce their own sugar and oxygen. And so they expire oxygen. which is why plants are so important in the world, right? So we produce carbon dioxide, they can consume it and produce oxygen, which is perfect. So this is the basic kind of equation of metabolism, right? So in one direction we have photosynthesis, and in the other direction we have cellular respiration. So as animals, we undergo cellular respiration. So this is just a picture of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, just kind of showing where these chemical reactions take place in the plant and the animal. So in the plant, we're talking about the chloroplast and photosynthesis, and in the animal, we're talking about cellular respiration in that mitochondria to produce energy. So again, just kind of hopefully a little bit of review from biology, right? So we started talking about essential nutrients, right? So what is required for most animals? Now we just said all plants and animals require energy and water. So water is obviously the number one essential nutrient for pretty much all life, right? And then we need energy. So energy has an asterisk because we can get that energy in a couple of different ways. So we'll have a whole lecture on the differences between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. But they are basically how we get energy into our body and into our cells, right? Now, what are the other essential nutrients? Now, we need amino acids. So proteins are made up of amino acids. So amino acids are our nitrogen source. So we need a source of nitrogen, and that's going to be those amino acids. Okay, so we're going to have some essential amino acids. We're going to have some essential fatty acids, right? So fats, lipids are made up of fatty acids. So we'll talk all about that as well. We're also going to need minerals. Okay, so there's macro minerals and micro minerals are called trace minerals. And so that has to do with the amount of the mineral that we require. So macro minerals, we require more of them, and trace or micro minerals, we don't require quite as much. We only require those trace amounts, but they're still an essential nutrient. Okay, so we'll have a whole lecture on minerals and also vitamins, right? So there are vitamins that are essential, and they can either be fat or water soluble. So what do they dissolve in? So if they dissolve in fat, they're fat soluble. If they dissolve in water, they're water soluble. And there's going to be other kind of random nutrients that we'll talk about, and that can kind of be species dependent, right? So just to name a few, such as taurine, choline, and carnitine. Okay. So we said that most animals require all of those nutrients, but what can affect these needed requirements? It can depend on the GI tract of the species, right? So that gastrointestinal tract and how they absorb nutrients and things like that. So that can definitely affect the needed requirement, right? The age of the animal. So that's our graph on the left. So if you notice, adults require a certain amount of all those things on the x-axis, such as protein, vitamin D, iron, calcium, and so on. And then if you look at a young child, right, or a young animal is comparative, right, they need quite a bit more of those nutrients than an adult of the same species, right? So that's kind of common across the board, right? A young, growing animal is going to require a bit more nutrients than an adult animal, right, of the same species. We can also talk about level of productivity, right? So is the animal a production animal, right? So are they pregnant or lactating, especially in the dairy world, right? So this is the requirement for beef cattle, but you can definitely talk about it in the dairy cattle as well. So if you look at the far right, you can look at the lactating cow requirement versus these other row gestating cows. Even stressed calves need a little bit more. Growing cows need a little bit more, right? So you can compare those columns, and you can notice that the lactating cow requires quite a bit more of these minerals than the dry cows, right? So the non-lactating cows. So just an example, right, of how levels of productivity can affect that needed requirement. So as far as our energy sources, we said that we have a couple of different options, and so that can be species dependent as well. So depending on which species you are, you may require a different energy source or may be able to use a different energy source. So when we talk about our carnivores and omnivores, right, so carnivores specifically only eat animals, and omnivores eat plants and animals. They are going to be able to use fat and protein more so than our herbivores are really going to strictly only eat plants and use carbohydrates as energy. Now, our omnivores can definitely use carbohydrates as well, so they're kind of the in-between, right? They can use all sources for energy. So that's kind of where the diets come into play of what energy source is best for that species, right? And what kind of a animal they are and what they eat.
I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you are someone who's trying to lose weight, you need to focus.
So now let's get into a little bit about animal feed composition. So animal feeds can be simple to complex, right? So mostly when you go into a feed store, you kind of look at the shelves, right? And there's so many options out there. There's so much marketing and PR for some of these brands and feeds that it's really hard to sometimes assess what's actually in an animal's feed. And not all feeds are created equal. And there are some analytical values that can definitely vary depending on laboratories and where those foods are created. And we've all heard horror stories about different companies and animal feeds that have, poisoned animals and caused problems. So that's something to just be aware of, because not all of these feeds have to go through testing and things like that. So you have to make sure that it's a well-tested laboratory and it comes from a well-tested laboratory. So again, that's kind of just something that we all learn over time, and we have to learn kind of what are the good brands and things like that. So I'm not going to, specifically talk about any one brand or another. I've just given two examples of some brands that are out there, some very popular brands. So I know Blue Wilderness has a lot of marketing, a lot of PR, but if you talk to most vets in the world, they don't recommend Blue Wilderness because they've had some problems with their nutrients in their feeds. And especially this whole grain-free movement, I'm going to talk a lot about that in a different lecture, but a lot of feeds are trying to go 100% grain-free. Your dog is like a wolf and needs just meat, right? Well, that's not true. So these grain-free diets have actually caused medical problems such as dilated cardiomyopathy, and it's a proven problem now. So again, you're going to have to watch some of this marketing and PR for some of these companies. Whereas if you look at a company like Purina, that's a very proven, reliable laboratory, you know that they're going through the appropriate testings and things like that for these diets. So not all components provide usable nutrients as well. So what do they actually put in these feeds, right? So let's talk about that. So what is actually in animal feed, right? So how do we actually assess what is in these products? So number one, right, there's going to be water in the animal feed, some amount, right? And we call that moisture, okay? And then two, we have the dry matter. Okay, so what is the dry matter made of? It's going to be made up of organic material and inorganic material. And the inorganic material they also refer to as ash. Okay, so what makes up that organic material? Well, these are going to be your proteins, or those nitrogen-containing amino acids, right? You're going to have lipids, which are fat soluble. You're going to have carbohydrates, water soluble, and you're going to have your vitamins that are both maybe fat and water soluble. Right, so that's going to be the organic material. So if you think back to organic chemistry, what is an organic compound? Right, we're going to talk about that in another lecture. Kind of your carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, all those organic compounds, right? So that's your organic material. Then you're going to have your inorganic material. These are your minerals, right? So minerals are usually metals, okay? So lots of metals are minerals. And so you have these macro elements and micro elements or micro minerals, okay? So that's also in your dry matter. And when you talk about the inorganic material and these minerals, any mineral can be toxic in excessive amounts. And sometimes that's what happens if you hear about a diet causing toxicity. It can be sometimes a mineral, okay? So minerals you have to be careful with, especially those micro or trace minerals. And we'll talk about that when we get to that lecture. So where does the organic material come from, right? So we're talking about the protein, the fats, the carbohydrates, the vitamins, right? And they're coming from plants and animals. So what is the composition of plants and animals? If we're talking about plants, we're mostly talking about water and carbohydrates, right? So when we're talking about carbohydrates, you're talking about those readily available sugars, right? Simple sugars that we'll talk about, and the fibrous components of carbohydrates, or those crude protein, cellulose, that's harder to break down, right? So we call them fiber, right? So we all know that there's plants out there that are high in fiber, right? And some are high in sugar. And so that's the same thing, right? These simple sugars versus complex sugars and fibers. But they're low in protein and fat, right? So high in carbs, low protein and fat. Now, if you're talking about animals are mostly fat and protein, right? So obviously they have water as well. So both plants and animals are mostly water, but you get 20% fat, 16% protein, and some minerals as well. So you got to remember they have some minerals, because especially when you're talking about whole animals, you're talking about bones too. And that's very important when we're talking about this whole idea of a balanced diet. And especially for those exotic animals, right? Feeding whole animals is very important. But they're low in carbs, right? So less than 1% carbohydrates. So this is the organic material that we're putting into our animal feed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well later when we talk about feeds. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we actually analyze animal feed. And the process is called approximate analysis. So essentially it's an analytical method to assess and compare feedstuffs. And it's proximate, meaning it's not exact. So usually it gives you a % of the animal feed that is that certain nutrient. So a couple of terms that we need to get into our head when we're talking about nutrition and diets and proximate analysis is dry matter feed versus as fed. So dry matter, you're only talking about the dry matter. That's the organic and inorganic material. You remove the moisture from the diet. And that's a really good way to be able to compare diets. So we'll talk about comparing diets on a dry matter basis, it's called. Versus as fed means just that. It's how the food is fed. So it has the moisture in it. It has everything in it. So you're not removing anything. So that's an as fed diet. Okay. So there's two different matters of thought here. But usually we want to compare diets on a dry matter basis. It gives you a better accurate assessment. So then we have to figure out what else is in there, right? So if you get your dry matter, you take out your moisture, how much is protein, right? So that's your crude protein. How much is fat, right? So an ether extract. And then you look at your ash, which is the inorganic materials, right? Your minerals. And then you have crude fiber, right? So we said fiber is a carbohydrate, right? So you can figure out how much is fiber. And then they have what's called a nitrogen-free extract. So we'll talk a little bit about that, where you actually remove the nitrogen. And so it's a way of looking at protein without the nitrogen. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how we actually get these different values. Okay. And so on the right-hand side, I have kind of a flow chart here of how they actually go through this proximate analysis process. And so you're going to dry the food, right? So you're going to get all the moisture out so that you have a moisture-free sample. You're going to go through a process that gives you the protein. That's the Kjeldahl process. Okay, I know that's a weird word. You don't need to know these processes for this class, okay? You just need to know what the proximate analysis is, what we use it for, things like that. And then you're going to do an ether extraction. So that way you have this fat-free residue, so you remove the fat. Right, so you remove the fat, so we removed the protein, we've removed the fat. Now you're left with essentially the inorganic material, the ash, and the carbohydrates, right, or the fiber. So then you separate, you burn it, you burn off all that fiber, the organic material, and you're left with the inorganic ash. That's why they refer to it as ash, because they actually burn it, and then what's left is your inorganic material. Okay, so this is just kind of a simplified kind of flow diagram for the proximate analysis. So this just talks through a little bit about what we already discussed through this proximate analysis. So how do we get that percent crude protein? And essentially it's this Kjeldahl method of removing the nitrogen containing material, which is our protein, right? So then if you remove that material, that's going to be your percent of crude protein out of that feed. And then the same thing with the ether extract, right? It's the percent of fats. So you're going to remove the fats and the fatty acids from the feed using a method with ether, right? Ether extraction. And this is really the very high caloric value material, right? So we know that fat is high in calories, right? Provides lots of energy. And so that's the percent ether extract. And then again, that percent of ash is all that kind of material that's left after you've burned off all the organic material. And this is really your minerals, okay? And so this is just, just to kind of go through what those processes are again. But you, again, don't need to know the exact processes of how they get these different values, okay? I just want you to know what they are and what they mean, right? So there's one last value we need to talk about, and that's the nitrogen-free extraction. So I think a lot of people get a little confused about that NFE, or nitrogen-free extraction. So we know what the crude fiber is, right? So we said crude fiber is the carbohydrates, but this is really the structural carbohydrates, the kind of indigestible portion of the plant. So this is the cellulose, okay? So crude fiber, it's in the name, right? It's fiber. Most of us kind of know what fiber is, right? Plants that are high in fiber. So these are really those indigestible carbohydrate portions. And of course, there are animals out there, such as ruminants and a lot of herbivores, that are able to digest fiber and cellulose, right, with the help of bacteria, things like that. And we'll talk about that when we get to our carbohydrate lecture. But really the crude fiber, think of it as the indigestible carbohydrates, okay? Whereas the nitrogen-free extract is essentially the digestible carbohydrate portion of the diet, or our sugars, essentially, okay? And so how do we actually get the NFE, or the nitrogen-free extract, is we have to subtract everything else that we just talked about, okay? So it's the difference between that original sample weight of the feed, right? And the sum of the water, right? So we've removed moisture, the ether extract, which is our fat, our crude protein, our crude fiber, and finally that ash, right? So if we remove all of that stuff we've already just measured, then that difference is going to be our nitrogen-free extract, which is the digestible carbohydrate portion of the diet. And that's important, right? Because we know that sugar is a very important energy source, right? So that's what we're trying to get, is that percent of nitrogen-free extract, or think of it percent of sugar. You can even call it that if you want to mentally think of it that way, right? Because that's that digestible kind of simple sugar carbohydrate portion, okay?
What science says about
So now there's another term called a guaranteed analysis. So we just talked about the proximate analysis, and that's kind of the process of how you analyze what is in a feed, right? And it gives you a percent of the different nutrients in the feed. Now, a guaranteed analysis is an example of an as-fed food label of information, right? So this is what you're actually going to be looking at when you look at the back of animal feed bag, right? So this is what you're actually looking at, right? So this is an as-fed example. So it's not dry matter, but it has the moisture in it as well. So what did we say? As-fed includes the moisture, right? So that's a guaranteed analysis. And this is not precise, right? So just like we said, the proximate analysis is not really precise. It gives you kind of a percent. So a lot of the times these even give you a range of what's in the food. So it may say a minimum of this or a maximum of this. So it's definitely not precise. And so you have to keep that in mind, unless you're talking about minerals, okay, and vitamins. So vitamins and minerals, they tend to be precise because of the problem with toxicity, right? So there is a chance that, you want to be exact with the vitamins and minerals because they can be toxic, right? Especially if you're talking about things like selenium. Selenium has a very narrow also safety margin. Okay, so things like that where you want to make sure you have the exact amount. But if you look at the other things in here, usually you say, okay, well, if we look at calcium, right, there's a minimum, there's a maximum, or just a minimum, right? So a lot of these are minimums, right? So there's a minimum of this in there or a maximum of that. Okay. And so even they'll say, this thing isn't an essential nutrient, it's just an added thing in the diet, but most things are essential nutrients, essentially in the diets, okay? So these are guaranteed analyses, okay, of the food. So now how do we actually compare diets and the nutrients within those diets? So we said that the proximate analysis kind of gives you the numbers for everything that's in there, but they're still percents, right? And then we said the as-fed guaranteed analysis is what you actually are looking at on the diet. So if you turn over and look at the label and you want to compare, maybe a dry food versus a wet food for a cat or a dog, and you want to see, okay, well, how much protein is actually in these two diets or how much fat is actually in these diets, because maybe you want, a diet that has higher protein in it for some, maybe a medical reason or something like that. So how do we actually compare them, okay? And we call these dry matter calculations or as-fed conversions. So essentially we want to compare the diets on a dry matter basis. So what does that mean? Because the guaranteed analysis is as-fed, right? So it has the moisture in it. So to convert it to dry matter, you remove the moisture content from the feedstuffs to get that dry matter value, okay? So it's a common way to compare feeds on this dry matter basis, right? So why don't we go through an example of how we actually do this? And I'm going to use a marker here on the PowerPoint, and hopefully you'll be able to see it, okay? Because what happens is if you just look at the diet at the guaranteed analysis, so say we have a dry food, right? A cat food, that's a dry food. It says it's 30% protein, 10% moisture, right? And then we look at the canned food and it says 9% protein, but 78% moisture. Now we want to compare the protein, and that looks pretty obvious, right? Well, it looks like the dry food has more protein because it says it has 30% protein versus only 9% protein. But if you look at the moisture difference, that canned food or wet food has a lot more moisture, so it throws off that value of the protein, right? So first thing we have to do is we have to take moisture out. So let's call the dry food diet A, right, and the canned food diet B. So if we go through and remove our moisture out of A, so it's in percents, right? So we want to remove the moisture. So say we have 100%, right? Since it's in percents, we want to remove that 10% moisture, and we're left with 90%, right? Okay. Now, if we go back to our diet B, if we remove the moisture, we say we have 100%, and we're going to remove our moisture, which is 78%, and we're left with 22%. Okay. Now, how do you actually compare the protein? Okay. So if we do a ratio, right, we're going to have to kind of solve for X. So this is going to be where kind of some math comes into play. And again, if you have any trouble with doing any of these math problems or anything like that, I would be more than happy to meet with you guys on Zoom or come to office hours, right? And I can go through these practice problems and things, and I'll give you guys more practice problems to work through on how to actually do the math, right? So we're going to have to do a ratio essentially, right? So for our dry food, we say we have 30% protein. So we're going to do 30%, right? But it's going to be out of 90, not out of 100, right? Because we've removed our moisture. Now that's going to be an X amount out of 100. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for that actual amount of protein, and that's X. So we want to solve for X, right? So we do our cross multiplication, right? Which is 90 times X equals 30 times 100, right? So 3,000. Okay, and then you solve for X by dividing by 90, right? Sorry, it's getting a little squished here at the bottom. Okay, so if we have our calculator, right? X equals 33.3 essentially and change. So X equals 33%. Okay. So that's how much protein is actually in there. And that makes kind of sense that it's a little bit higher, but not too much because we have only 10% moisture. Now let's do the same thing for our wet food, okay? So we have 9% protein, but that's out of 22 instead of out of 100. Now 9 out of 22, okay, equals our value we're looking for out of 100, right? So we cross multiply. That's 22x equals 900, okay? So we're going to divide by 22 to solve for x. So what does x equal, right? And that's going to be approximately 40 to 41%, 40.9. So we can say 41% if we round up. Okay. And so if you actually compare it, our diet B or the canned food actually has more protein in it, right? So it actually has 41% protein versus our dry food has 33% protein, right? So if we didn't do that, if we didn't compare them on a dry matter basis, you would just kind of assume that, okay, the dry food says it has 30% protein, right? So but you can't compare those numbers because it's not a value, right? It's a percent of the diet. So you have to take moisture into account. You have to remove the moisture from the as-fed value into the dry matter basis. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I know it's a little sloppy on there with the PowerPoint, but again, if you have questions on how to do the math, anything like that, let me know and we can walk it through, okay, step by step. Okay. So that's pretty much it for this lecture. I have a lot of nutritional resources for you guys that are really good things to look up. you can find interesting articles, reviewed journals, publications, very good stuff. And also the AAFCO is kind of the, it's this nonprofit corporation that essentially defines ingredients and things like that that are used in pet food. So AAFCO, if you see, the AAFCO approved foods, it means it's gone through some sort of process of evaluation. So the National Academy of Press is really good for kind of nutrient requirements. So you can look up different species and what their nutrient requirements are. PubMed, right? You can look for nutritional information on PubMed, which are all reviewed journals. And then AAFCO, of course, has all of their kind of things and how they review feeds and things like that. So it's kind of interesting to look through AAFCO. So these are just some websites for you that you aren't required to go through, but good references. Okay. So next week we'll be talking about energy. Okay. So we talked a lot about, we require energy. It's one of our nutritional requirements, but we can get energy in many different forms. But what is energy and how do we talk about energy in the realm of nutrition, right? Because mostly we're talking about digestible energy, which is what we're actually absorbing into our body and using in our cells. Okay. So it's chapter 10 in the textbook, and that's energy. Thanks a lot. I'll see you guys next week. Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture number 2. We will be talking about energy today. So a lot of you guys are probably familiar with energy. We all expend energy every day, but there's a difference between energy in the form of work and chemical energy. So mechanical energy versus chemical energy. So what we're really going to be focusing on today is chemical energy. But first, let's do a little bit of review from last lecture. So let's do a little review. So last time we talked about the difference between diets on an as-fed basis versus a dry matter basis and how we do those dry matter conversions and how we take moisture out. So go ahead and work through this problem on your own. Pause the video. Make sure you're able to work through the problem comparing the amount of fats in these two diets. And you're going to come up with which diet has the lowest amount of fat on a dry matter basis. Okay, so hopefully you were able to pause the video. If not, I highly recommend it. But let's go through the answer. So again, I'm going to try to do some pen writing on the PowerPoint slide. It may not come out as well. I'm mostly going to talk us through it, right? So if we want to compare on a dry matter basis, we're going to have to remove the moisture from the diet first, right? So if we remove the moisture in diet A, 100 minus 9% is going to give us 91%, right? And same on diet B, if we're going to remove the moisture from diet B, we're going to minus 78 from 100, which gives us 22%. Okay, so what's our next step? So first step, we remove the moisture. Second step, we want to find out how much fat is actually in the diet without the moisture. So now we're going to divide our fat from our new percent, right, without moisture. So that's going to be in diet A, 11% divided by 91%. Okay, and then in diet B, we're going to divide 4.4% divided by 22%, okay? But then we want to figure out how much that is in a percent, right? So we're going to get a decimal, but we want to figure out in a percent. So we could do our cross multiplication, solve for x like we did on our last one, or we just know when we divide 11 by 91, we're going to get 0.12, okay, which equals 12%. Oops, sorry, I wrote that backwards. 12%, right? So that means we have 12% crude fat in diet A. Now diet B, we're going to divide 4.4 by 22, which gives us 0.2, which equals 20%. Okay. So again, in the last one, I showed you kind of the long way to do it. If you divide the 2 and times it by 100, that'll give you the percent, right? So if we're asking what is the lowest amount of fat in the diet, 12% is clearly lower than 20%, so it's going to be our diet A. Okay, so again, if you have any questions about that, definitely come to office hours and we can work through it. Email me if you have any questions. We can set up a Zoom meeting, anything you need. So what are we going to be talking about today? So first, we're going to define what energy is. We said a little bit about mechanical versus chemical, so what are the differences? And then we're going to go through our energy terminology. How do we talk about energy? And then what does our body use with that energy? What does it do with that energy, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about metabolism and maintenance energy, pretty much the energy that is required to survive and keep all of our chemical processes functioning in our body. And And then we'll talk a little bit about bioenergetics and energy requirements in terms of mass, right? Maybe you might think the bigger the animal needs more energy, which partially is true. So we'll talk about how mass and body size comes into play when we're talking about energy and metabolism. And then energy utilization. How do we actually use that energy? When do we need more energy, right? Things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So mostly, again, we're going to be focusing on that chemical energy, and then we're going to talk about how we utilize that energy in our body. So what is energy, right? So it's the capability of doing work, but what is work, right? Work is a given force over a certain distance. So this is really considered mechanical energy, right? So this is mechanical energy, you're doing work, versus chemical energy is what we're talking about when we're talking about nutrition, is actually a potential energy that we have in the food that we eat. So the food that we eat has calories, so we'll talk about what a calorie is, and that calorie or that potential energy in the food is going to give us energy in our body to have chemical processes work, okay? So we'll talk about all of that. So what is a calorie, right? So let's talk about how we talk about energy in units, right? So what is a calorie unit? And this calorie we're talking about is lowercase calorie. And this is the heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. Okay. Now, what is a kilocalorie? Now, a kcal or a kilocalorie is 1,000 lowercase calories. But this is really how we talk about food in the terms of 1 big calorie. Okay, so when you look on the back of a Snickers bar and it says it has 220 calories, those are kcals. Those are big C calories. Okay, so times that by 1,000 and that's how many little calories it has. Okay, so I know that that can be confusing. And then we can even get bigger in terms of megacalories is 1,000,000 lowercase calories, right, or 1,000 uppercase calories. Now, when we're talking about other energy, so calories, we kind of dedicate to nutrition and chemical energy. But when we're talking about joules, that's another way of talking about energy in the form of work. Okay, it's kind of a standard unit of energy. And so this is the energy required to displace 1 Newton, okay, which is a weight, 1 meter, which is a distance, right? So that's what we said what work was. And when we talk about it in terms of calories, 1 calorie is about 4.184 joules. Okay, so just another energy unit that some people talk about is the joule. Okay, and I have a calorie video here that I have posted on Canvas for you, or you can follow the link through the PowerPoint. So why do we care about joules and work in terms of kind of mechanical energy? Well, that's what we can talk about when we talk about energy expenditure. So how much energy are we actually expending, right? So this is another form of expressing energy, and it's energy per amount of time. So unit of energy per amount of time is energy expenditure. And so we're very familiar with these terms in our everyday life, right? So if you talk about a watt, like a wattage in a light bulb, right? 40 watts, 60 watts, 100 watts, the higher watts you get, the more energy output you have, right? And so 1 watt equals 1 joule per second. So we said that what a joule was in the terms of calories as well. So we can still convert that to calories if we wanted to, right? And then we always talk about horsepower, right? Horsepower for cars, things like that. And that's 746 joules per second. Now, I'm not going to ask you these specific energy units for watt and horsepower. I just want you to be aware of kind of what, how we talk about energy and energy expenditure, okay? And how it relates to calories and chemical energy. So we can even talk about energy expenditure in terms of animals, thinking of them kind of like light bulbs, right? So this is just kind of for fun, right? So if you talk about the energy expenditure of a 55-pound Australian Shepherd, you might compare that to a 75-watt light bulb, okay? So that's how much energy they're expending, okay, per second. But if you talk about a dairy cow, do you think it'll be higher or lower? Much higher, right? Much, much higher. They're producing milk. So that's 20 light bulbs at 100 watts each. Right? So that is a lot more energy than an Australian Shepherd, right? Which makes sense. It makes sense. But just to kind of give you that, comparison in the terms of something else, right? So energy expenditure is very important when we talk about energy requirements for different animals. So we're not going to get too far into the laws of thermodynamics, but just to review a little bit of the first law of thermodynamics is the conservation of energy, right? So energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So when we're expending any energy, right, we had to get that energy from somewhere. And so that is how nutrition comes into play. We must ingest our energy as chemical energy to be able to transform that energy into kinetic or mechanical energy in doing work, right? So just like we talked about in our first lecture, right? When we were talking about cellular respiration and then plants being able to do photosynthesis, they turn light energy into chemical energy. So, we're all just transferring energy into different forms, okay? And so this is really coming into play when we talk about the energy balance equation. So we're going to intake energy, right, in the form of calories, right, if we're going to eat our food, and that's going to supply us with our body energy stores, right? So anything we need to do, any chemical reactions in our body, but also any sort of energy expenditure. So we'll talk about those different types of energy expenditures towards the end of the lecture, right? So we have to be able to take in enough energy to be able to create these other energies or utilize that energy in different ways in our body, okay? So now let's go through our energy terminology in nutrition. So how do we talk about energy when we're talking about nutrition? So we talk about calories, right? Things like that. But when we talk about what we eat and how we utilize that energy, we're going to have some different terminologies. So the gross energy is the entire energy that we consume, okay? And then we're going to go through all of these other energies as well. So then we have digestible energy. What is the actual digested energy that we get from our food? Because we're going to have some fecal output, right? We're going to produce feces, and that's unusable energy. So we're going to have some energy loss there. Now, what about metabolizable energy? Okay, metabolizable energy is the energy going into the metabolism, right? Because we're going to lose some energy in the form of urine. Okay, so we're going to lose some waste. So essentially, in the first two steps, we're getting rid of that waste in the form of feces and in the form of urine, which are both losses of energy. Okay. Now, metabolizable energy is then going to be further broken down, and it gets a little more confusing from there. So we're going to break all of this down as we go. So then we're going to end up getting this kind of net energy and maintenance energy that are really going to be what we kind of talk about. Okay, so we really want our maintenance energy, and that's what we are going to survive on. That's how we keep our whole body functioning, right? And then production energy is going to be kind of the extra energy that we need to produce anything. Just like we talked about the dairy cow. That's a production animal, right? They're lactating, they're producing milk, so they're producing something, and that requires more energy, okay? So we'll break this down. So what is gross energy? We said that it's everything that we ingest, right? But how do we actually put a quantitative number to that? And so how we do that is we actually measure the quantity of heat when we completely oxidate a food or a feed, right? So that's combustion. So we essentially figure out how much heat is being produced from that food when we combust it, okay? When we burn it for fuel, okay? So this obviously depends on all of the organic molecules in the food. So that's the amount of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all of those organic molecules, okay? And we measure this in a thing called a bomb calorimeter, okay? So bomb calorimeter is something that it essentially ignites the food, it burns it as fuel, and then it measures the heat coming off of that combustion, okay? And again, this is something that, we're not going to do in class or anything like that, but if you want to look it up, it's quite interesting, and there's a lot of different bomb calorimeters out there, but it's how you find out how much potential energy is in that food. And this is a max theoretical energy, right, that can be obtained from the food, but it's really not a physiological measurement because we are a biological system, and no system is 100% efficient, right? There's no way that we can utilize 100% of the energy that we ingest, right? So we're going to lose some as feces, as urine, we're going to lose it at heat, things like that we are going to lose energy as we convert the energy into different forms of energy, right? So this is a really just kind of a theoretical number, okay? It is a quantitative number, that's how much energy is in that food, but it's really not a physiological number for us. So that's why we need to break it down even further.
Hey everyone, I'm Tulika. I used to speak in
So this is just a picture of the bomb calorimeter. So how they put the food in there, they heat it up, right? And then they have all of these ways to figure out the heat in the water, right? And then you can actually figure out the heat in the thermometer coming off of that water, coming off of that food that's being ignited and burned, okay? So that's just kind of how it works if you're interested. You don't need to know, any of this stuff for this class, okay? You don't need to know how a bomb calorimeter works. So this table just kind of shows you the different gross energy values of some of our different food sources. So this is in terms of megajoules per kilogram on a dry matter basis, okay? So don't worry too much about the the units, right? Let's just kind of compare some of these different things. So if we look at the fats, right? So if you look at butter fat, fat in animal tissues, those are probably the highest, right? Or oils, right? Fats from oil seeds, that's the highest amount of energy that we can get, okay? So fats are really kind of our number one energy nutrient, okay? Then if you look at the muscle, right, as a protein, right, that's kind of the middle of the road, okay? And then if you look at the carbs, which is interesting about the carbs, so let's go down to the bottom, maybe the feeds, right? If you look at maize grain, which is corn, okay, corn versus oat straw, they have the same number, okay? So when we're talking about gross energy, it's really not very helpful to evaluate the nutritional value of fiber. So fiber is a carb, right, a carbohydrate. So obviously corn is a lot more nutritious than straw, right? So again, it's not too helpful because it says, oh, well, they're about equal on the energy level. But again, nutritionally, they're not the same. So it's not really too helpful to evaluate fiber, okay? Just to kind of have an idea. But in general, right, we're kind of saying that, fat has the highest, protein's kind of in the middle, because if you look at the glucose, cellulose, starch, right, they're all kind of on the lower end. So those are our carbohydrates, okay? You might think, oh, well, sugar has the highest energy, right? But not necessarily. Glucose is actually on the lowest end, okay? So now let's keep going along our graph. So now we talked about gross energy. Let's talk about digestible energy. So that's our intake of food, which is our gross energy, minus the energy lost in feces, right? Or fecal energy, FE. So this is really the largest amount of energy that's lost is through the feces, and it really depends on the species and their GI tract for how much energy we actually lose. So when you're talking about ruminant species that have, an area where they ruminate and ferment food, they're actually extracting a lot more energy from their food than, say, an omnivore such as us that doesn't ferment our food. So it just depends on the species and that GI tract, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in another lecture. But you might see a term called total digestible nutrients, or TDN. And this is a comparable term to digestible energy, okay? But they use this term for ruminants and swine. So it's just a different way of saying digestible energy. It's very comparable. There are only some slight differences, and TDN can be a little more accurate, I'd say, specifically for those species, which is why they use it. So now we have our metabolizable energy. Okay, so this is ME. So this is the food that we ingest, right, our gross energy, minus that fecal energy. And then we're now going to subtract our urine energy and some gases. Now the gases can be variable, okay? So the gases are variable depending on the species and the GI tract as well. But in general, urine loss is fairly consistent. Okay, so urine loss, if you go back to kind of, your biology, physiology, what do we lose in urine, right? That's metabolic waste. So what happens when we have our chemical processes happening in the cells? We're going to produce some waste, and we consider that, metabolic waste, okay, which is fairly consistent, right? Because we're all, our cells are all undergoing, similar processes, which are producing similar amounts of metabolic waste. So it's fairly consistent, the amount of energy that we lose in our urine, okay? Whereas fecal energy can be quite dependent upon the species. Urine energy loss is fairly consistent across species. Maybe different, groups of species, but in general, right, it can be fairly consistent. And then again, the only thing is the gases can be kind of variation among the species as well. So now we get into our net energy. So net energy is really important because that is the portion of energy that's really available for the maintenance and various productive purposes of the animal. Okay, so this is really what's going to keep us alive and keep us going, and any sort of productive purposes on top of that. So we do have one thing that we're going to remove from the net energy, and don't worry too much about it, but we call it heat increment and the heat of fermentation. So essentially what that means is that's the heat required to metabolize the food in our body. So that's the heat, the kind of energy that we're putting in to break down and metabolize that food. And that's what the heat increment is. So of course it's fairly small if we kind of think about the overall energy, but we're going to have to put a little bit of energy in to break down and metabolize that food. Okay, but then we're going to get a net energy at the end of that can go into maintenance and production. Okay. So again, what do we have left out of that net energy, right? We have production energy and we have maintenance energy. So these are really what are really important when we're talking about the life processes. So energy for our metabolism, our basal metabolism, producing heat, thermoregulation, muscular work, just kind of the body functioning work, right? So digestion, urination, things like that are happening in the body, right? Any sort of waste, right? Any sort of waste functions, that's all going into our energy maintenance. And that's really the energy required for survival, right? To neither gain nor lose energy. And that's just to maintain, right? To stay the same, to keep everything working and functioning at an appropriate level, at a healthy level. Okay, that's maintenance. Now, energy production is really on top of maintenance, right? So that's anything where you're going to go a little above and beyond your maintenance requirement. So such as the dairy cow we talked about, lactating, producing milk, right? Work, right? If you're doing any sort of physical work that's above and beyond your maintenance work, right? That's all considered production energy. So let's talk a little bit more about energy maintenance. So it's really the energy intake required to maintain a constant body weight, right? So that's what our goal is, to kind of maintain that constant body weight. Now at maintenance, right, our metabolizable energy that we intake should equal about our energy expenditure, if we're going back to that energy balance equation, right? Now, if we have a positive energy balance, we're going to increase our body weight. Now we know that all too well, right? If you increase your energy you intake, you're going to increase your body weight, which maybe we are all experiencing currently, being as we are all staying in and eating more food, right? Now, a negative energy balance is the body weight decreasing, right? So you take in less than what you require, right? And so that's where you get a little bit of weight loss. Now, you may want to be in one of those two categories, depending on your body weight. But in general, right, if you maintain a consistent body weight or a constant body weight, that is what maintenance energy is all about, okay? So let's now go through the components of our maintenance energy expenditure. What is this energy used for, right? What is this maintenance energy used for? Now, the majority of it, 50 to 80% of it, is really resting energy expenditure, right? So that's that basal metabolism. That's all of our processes, our cellular processes, digestive processes, all of that waste, right? All of that. That's our resting energy expenditure. That's what the majority of it is going to. Now we talked about that heat increment, right? So we have to break down that nutrient for metabolism, right? We have to add in some heat. Now we're going to use some of our maintenance energy for that, right? We also have some physical activity. Now that can be fairly variable, right? 10 to 40%, just depending on how much physical activity, how much muscular work you're doing. And that can be, in the normal range of physical activity of day-to-day life, right? Of an animal or of us. Now, thermoregulation can be quite variable as well, because that can be dependent on the environment that you're in, right? So let's go through these individually. So let's go through each of these components of energy expenditure. So the biggest category is the resting energy expenditure, we called it, which is also referred to as the basal metabolism or basal metabolic rate, BMR. So this is the minimal amount of energy expended to sustain the body, so to keep the body alive. This does not mean that you will maintain the same body weight, okay? So this is the minimal amount required for survival, to sustain all of the body functions, okay? Now, it's the single largest contributor to our total energy expenditure, right? We said, over 50%. Now, of that, 50, 60% or whatever it is, about 25% of it is going to go towards circulation, respiration, secretion, muscle tone, things like that are required for survival, right? But the majority of it, or 75% of this basal metabolic rate, is required for kind of cellular processes, maintaining those membrane gradients across the cells, synthesizing proteins and other macromolecules. So pretty much think cellular function, right? So cellular functions, metabolic processes, okay? So that's the majority of it is going towards that. Now, there are some factors that can affect our basal metabolic rate, right? So age. Okay, it increases when we're young, right? But then it declines as we age over time. So if you look at our graph, right, our basal metabolism kind of spikes when we're really young, when we're only a couple years old, right? And then by the time we are 10, right, or even 20, we've lost a significant amount of our basal metabolic rate, okay? So we don't require as much energy to maintain our basal metabolism, essentially. Okay, and that even further decreases as we age. We kind of plateau, right? Middle age, we kind of plateau, and then we drop off a little bit after 50 or 60, right? Now, neuroendocrine factors can change the basal metabolic rate. Gender, right? Males versus females. If you notice on the graph even that the males have a slightly higher basal metabolism than females, right? Season. right? Season can definitely change that. Also stress, right, can affect our hormones. So this is when we talk about neuroendocrine factors, we're mostly talking about hormones that are affecting the basal metabolism, okay? So gender has to do with sex hormones, seasons, right? When you have kind of, you talk about seasonal depression and things like that, melatonin. So melatonin is a hormone, right? As well as our stress hormones. Different species and breeds, right, can be different, right? Size, and we'll talk a little bit about that, right? Body size, body mass, but even breeds within a species can be different as well, right? I know a lot more about horses. You have those really fat ponies, right, that can live off of air pretty much, and they're just always fat no matter what you feed them. And then there's those racehorses that you cannot feed them enough food to keep weight on them, right? So again, can be species or breed dependent, right? Just depends on that basal metabolism. There's miscellaneous things, training, mental effort, things like that can definitely increase your basal metabolism. So there are a lot of factors that can affect the basal metabolism requirement, right? Energy requirement for the basal metabolism. So now let's talk about that heat increment that we've talked about before, right? The amount of heat needed to metabolize the food that you eat. And we call that the thermic effect of feeding, okay? That means that you increase the energy expenditure following a meal, right? If anyone kind of has experienced that, right, you maybe get a little warmer, a little flushed or something like that when you eat a meal, right? Because you have to increase that energy to digest and metabolize the food that you just ate. And so when you talk about the differences between different digestive tracts, that has an effect on the thermic effect of feeding. So when you talk about monogastrics, things with one stomach like us, only about 10 to 15% of energy expenditure is going towards that for monogastrics. Now you kind of increase or even double that at least for ruminants. That means they put a lot more energy, a lot more heat increment into digesting and metabolizing their food because they're fermenting and ruminating, and it takes a lot longer of a process. It takes a lot more energy to break down and digest all of that food. So again, it not only depends on the digestive tract of the species, but it also depends on how much food you take, the level of food intake, right? The more you eat, the more energy you need to put in to break it down. And also the diet composition. What did you eat? Okay, so it takes a bit more energy to break down protein than it does carbohydrates and then fat. So fat kind of takes the least amount of energy to break down, but protein takes the most. Okay, so if you look at our graph, right, we increase that percent of basal metabolic rate going towards this thermic effect, right, as we follow eating a meal, hours following eating a meal. Okay. So we need to, they all increase, and then the protein just requires quite a bit more than the carbs and the fats or lipids, okay? So our third component of energy expenditure is physical activity, and this can be quite variable. So it's the most variable component of our maintenance energy, and it's associated with that muscular activity. So it really can depend on what the animal is doing, right? Because we do have different species as well that have different maximum aerobic capacities. If you think of a horse versus a cow, right, your max aerobic capacity is 10 times your minimal energy expenditure. Okay, so that's just kind of a fun fact. You don't really need to know that, but physical activity can be very variable. Okay, but it does account for quite a bit of our energy expenditure for maintenance. Okay. Now, our fourth and last component of our energy expenditure is thermoregulation. And this is really the amount of energy required to maintain our body temperature. Now, keeping our body at the correct temperature is very important for our metabolism, right? So we don't function outside of a certain body temperature range, right? So if you go outside of that ideal thermoneutral zone, we call it, where the outside temperature is, about the same as the inside temperature, we're not working any harder to increase or decrease our body temperature. But when we talk about cold or heat stress, that can increase our energy expenditure quite significantly, right? So if you look at our thermoregulation graph, you have environmental temperature on the bottom, and you have this great thermoneutral zone, right, where we're neither working harder to increase or decrease our body temperature. But if you go outside that range, right, cold stress or heat stress, you're going to have an increase in the energy expenditure, right? So you're going to definitely need energy, right, if you're in the cold, but you're also going to need energy to cool yourself off as well, okay? So I know the heat stress seems a little counterintuitive, but you have to cool your body, and that takes energy, okay? Evaporative cooling, things like that, okay? So now let's talk a little bit about bioenergetics and nutrition. So bioenergetics is just really a different term for talking about energy and its metabolism in animals. Okay, so it's just a fancy term. Because energy is really the most important item in an animal's diet, okay? And all animal feeding standards are based on those energy requirements of that animal. So energy is really important in nutrition. They go hand in hand, right? So when you're talking about all these different diets, animal diets, these feeding standards, you're really talking about their energy needs, okay? So what's really interesting and what's really fascinating about bioenergetics, and when you're talking about these different species and these different animals, is really how much energy do they actually need, right? So if you take this little shrew and compare it to an elephant, you can say, okay, who needs more energy? Well, in terms of what, right? Okay, overall energy, the elephant needs more, right? It needs more food, it needs more energy. But if you're talking about the metabolism of that animal and how much energy does it need for its metabolism, then you're talking about a very different thing, because the shrew has such a high metabolic rate that it actually needs more energy per its body weight than an elephant, okay? So very interesting. So you have to always take basal metabolic rate into consideration when you're talking about energy requirements for an animal. So let's get into more detail about this body size and energy expenditure. Overall, larger animals expend more energy. That just makes sense, right? But smaller animals have higher metabolic rates per unit of body mass. That means that they require more energy for their size than larger animals. So again, let's look at our little shrew down here versus our elephant. So if we're talking about body mass or body size, the shrew is only 35 grams, but the elephant is 4.5 million grams, right? So quite a bit larger. But if you look at the metabolic rate of these two animals, the metabolic rate of the shrew is 890, right? Millimeters cubed of oxygen. You don't really have to worry about that unit of measurement per gram of body mass per hour, okay? So the elephant is only 75 per gram of body mass per hour, okay? So if you directly compare their metabolic rate, the shrew is significantly higher in their metabolic rate, right? So their requirement per metabolic rate is so much higher than an elephant, right? So I have a really fun video on Canvas for you guys kind of going over this idea of body mass and energy expenditure and how to blow up an elephant, okay? So it's kind of fun. Check it out. So if we look at these mass-specific metabolic rates, right, that's how we can compare some of these different animals. So this is a mass-specific metabolic rate on the left-hand side, or the y-axis, versus our mass, okay? So the shrew is way up there, right? Huge, very high metabolic rate, mass-specific metabolic rate for its size. And then if you go all the way down to the elephant, right, is one of the lowest. So kind of as you get larger, animals have lower metabolic rates, right? So even though an elephant is 200,000 times larger than a mouse, it has 1/12 of the mass-specific metabolic rate, okay? So that's just something to kind of think about. It's kind of cool, okay? So larger animals have a lower metabolic rate, smaller animals have a higher metabolic rate, okay? When we're talking about mass-specific metabolic rates. So why is that? So why do larger animals have lower mass-specific metabolic rates and smaller animals have higher mass-specific metabolic rates? It has to do with the surface area of the body. So body surface area plays a really large role when you're talking about that energy expenditure. Okay, so because smaller animals have a larger body surface area, they have a lot more area to lose heat. Okay, so they're actually losing a lot more energy. So they're losing a lot more energy, meaning they require a lot more energy. Okay, so we have to take that into account when we're talking about energy requirements for animals. You have to take mass into account. So we call that the mass exponent for energy expenditure. Okay, so you have to take weight in a kilogram. You have to take weight and mass into account. Okay. So if we look at our graph over here, right, we look at our different species on the left-hand side, and then we look at their weights, and we calculate their kcal requirements, or their big calorie requirements, per day versus per kilogram, okay, versus their body weight, okay? So if you look at per day, right, say we take our mouse, which is the smallest animal, if you talk about how much calories they need per day, it's quite small in comparison to, say, a cow, right, the bottom. But if you talk about their kcal requirement, their energy requirement per body weight, they require a significant more amount of energy than a cow, right? So you have to take that mass component into account when you're talking about energy requirements for animals, okay? So now let's talk about how we actually calculate those energy requirements for our animals. So first, let's talk about the energy requirements for most mammals. So these are really our domestic animals, most mammals that we're talking about. And then we'll kind of figure out, the differences as we go through the course. But when we're talking about basal metabolism, right, or our kcals per day, how many calories do they require per day, you're talking about just half of their maintenance, right? So basal metabolism is just what's required for survival, right? Remember we talked about what that basal metabolic rate was. Okay, that's just our cellular processes, circulation, respiration. That's about half of what our maintenance requirement is. So we're going to have to double our basal metabolic requirement to get our maintenance requirement. So remember, we have our weight exponent here, kilograms to the 0.75. That's for everyone. And then we're going to double that energy requirement to get to maintenance. So we go from 70 to 140. Now, you don't have to memorize all of these things because there are places you can look up what our nutrient requirements, maintenance requirements for different species. So you can look up these things, okay? So for example, the NRC for dogs, for our maintenance energy requirement is 132 times the kilogram, or the weight, right, to the 0.75, okay? So we take that mass exponent into consideration. And so then we can now calculate what is the maintenance energy requirement of a 30 kilogram Labrador Retriever, okay? So let's pause the video and see if we can work through that. Okay, so hopefully you were able to pause the video, and this is really where you are required to have a calculator, right, that does power functions. So unfortunately our cell phones are not that great for powers, unless maybe you have an Android. I'm not sure, but I know the iPhone doesn't have the power function, or the one that you can do different powers. So if you have kind of, a classic scientific calculator, or even just a regular calculator, it should have the little caret power function. So let's plug in our equation, right? So we're looking for kcals per day, okay? And we said that kcals were big calories, right? Or 1,000 small calories. So this is going to equal 132 times our weight in kilograms, which we said was 30. You about double the kilogram weight to get to the poundage. And we'll talk about that conversion in a minute. So this is about a 60 plus pound dog, okay? So to the power of 0.75. So if we plug that into our awesome calculator, it's going to do the math for us, and we end up with 1,692 kcals approximately, okay, per day. So that's our answer, okay? So that's how much energy requirements this dog needs per day, okay? So that's how we would calculate this. So you look up, you can always use the kind of classic, energy requirement of maintenance is about 140 if you don't know the specific NRC for that species, but you can always look it up, okay? So now let's talk about that weight conversion problem. So in our last problem, we had the weight in kilograms for our dog, but oftentimes your weight is going to be in pounds, right? Because we're weird here in America and we like to use pounds instead of kilograms. So most likely you're going to have a weight in pounds, but our equations are in kilograms. So you have to convert that weight into kilograms before you can plug it into the equation. So let's do some examples. So 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds. Okay, so remember I said that 30-pound dog, you roughly double the kilograms to get your pounds, right? So you'd roughly half the pounds to get your kilograms. Now that's a rough way of doing it, but we can actually do it accurately as well. So if you talk about a horse, it weighs about 1,200 pounds. Okay, that's kind of a large horse. Horses are around 1,000 pounds, but maybe it's this beautiful warm blood. That's 1,200 pounds, and we want to know what that horse weighs in kilograms. Okay. So if you want to pause the video and try to work it out yourself, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, let's work through it together. Okay, so how do we do the math, right? So if we have 1 kilogram, okay, a little algebra, is 2.2 pounds, okay? Now we set up our equation. Now we have the pounds, right? 1,200 pounds, but we want to know our x is the kilograms, okay? Now we do our cross multiplication. So we have 1,200 equals 2.2x. Now we solve for x, so we have to divide by 2.2. So 1,200 divided by 2.2 is 545 approximately. So x equals 545 kilograms approximately, okay? So it was like 545.45 if you did it on your calculator, okay? But we can kind of work with approximates, that's fine. So a 1,200 pound horse weighs approximately 545 kilograms. Now you can do that the opposite way as well, right? So if you know the kilograms and you want the poundage, you can reverse that and do it that way as well. So a trick is, if you know the kilograms and you want the pounds, you multiply by 2.2. Okay, so kilograms to pounds is you times by 2.2. If you have your pounds and you want your kilograms, I can do this, kilograms, you divide by 2.2. Okay, so that's the shortcut way of doing it. But if that doesn't make sense to you, go ahead and work through the problem, right? Do your algebra, okay? So let's just talk a little bit about energy utilization. This is a little bit more important, I would say, when you're talking about kind of productive animals, okay, like the dairy cattle industry. So they worry a lot about energy utilization. But what are some adaptations and acclimatizations that animals have undergone to help with energy utilization? So say you live in a really cold climate, right? So instead of always having to increase that energy expenditure for thermoregulation, you're going to maybe adapt in response to that cold environment. So for example, right, you have these cute seals that have fur and blubber, right? So that's how they have adapted or acclimatized to the cold climate to decrease that energy expenditure for thermoregulation, right? So things like that. You can also talk about it the other way in the desert, the way that animals have adapted to desert environments. So that's just kind of, something that we can talk about across species. But what about efficiency of energy utilization? So how efficient is the animal at utilizing the energy? Okay, so we can talk about kind of gross efficiency and net efficiency. So gross efficiency is the calorie value of a product, so kind of that gross energy that we talked about, right? And divide that by the calorie intake. So how much are you intaking? That's kind of gross efficiency. But net efficiency is that kind of gross efficiency, so kind of how much you take in, right, of the product, minus your maintenance, right? So what are you utilizing in maintenance? How much do you have left over? So that's how much do you have for like production, okay? So this is more important kind of for dairy production because they want their animals to be very efficient. So they want kind of this lower maintenance so that they have kind of higher energy levels for production, okay? But again, don't worry too much about this. It's just kind of how efficient of a system do you have, right, of this energy utilization. So don't worry too much about it, but it's just kind of an interesting idea, right? How efficient are we as biological systems in terms of energy utilization? So what's the big picture, right? So when we're talking about nutrition and energy, it's not a precise science, right? Yes, we can calculate all we want, those maybe exact energy requirements, right? Maintenance requirements for these animals. But when we're really talking about feed and diet requirements, there's really variation in the feeds. You can talk about quality, right, of the feeds, not just quantity. And there's various factors that can alter feed utilization. How efficient is that animal, right? Or the animal itself and its requirements, right? Maybe different stages of life, medical problems, right? Production animals. So there's kind of this big picture, right? It's not an exact science. That's what I'm here to tell you, right? Nutrition is definitely not an exact science. And there's a lot of factors why. Energy being one of them, right? So energy requirements are not an exact science. So that's it for energy. Next week, we're going to get into our first and probably most important nutrient, and that's water. So we're going to talk about water and kind of a little bit about dehydration, or what happens if we don't get enough water, right? And that's going to be chapter 6 out of your book. So go ahead and read ahead for that, and I'll see you guys next week. Thanks a lot.